yeah, welcome to everyone. We've got 34 at the moment, but I've actually got 54 people booked, so it's going to be a relatively big session. So we're going to have to be fairly formal, I'm afraid, as with just because of the number of people more than anything. Yeah, first of all, I think I'll just get you introduced to you Val Hall, who is from Equinox, the publishers of The Thought of Sangharakshita. I'll wave the book at you so you can see what it looks like if you haven't.
Hot off the press.
Hot off the press, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to just give your spiel, Val?
Oh, well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining this book launch. We're really pleased to be working with Robert. We've actually published a book of his last May, which is The Buddha's Middle Way. So that's going very well. So we're pleased to be publishing this book this month. And we've actually got another book by Robert, which is coming in early October. And that is called Red Book Middle Way. And it's an analysis of the Jungian Red Book. So that should be a good one. And perhaps we'll have another book launch like this for that. So have a look out for that. The book is available, and we're offering 25% off from orders from our website if you use the code EQX, which I think Robert said in his email to everyone. It's available in hardback, paperback, and ebook, but it's also available in all the other usual channels as well. So I hope you enjoy this lecture, and I hope you are inspired to buy the book afterwards. Okay,
great. Has anyone... So let's get straight on with something about the book, The Thought of Sangharakshita. So let's just start with a few very basic points. Why is Sangharakshita interesting? Why should anyone be interested in reading a book about him? Probably most of you know this, but just in case anyone doesn't. So Sangharakshita was a pioneering creative synthesizer, really, between Buddhism and the West. So he spent 20 years in India, then he came back to the UK to found the Triratna Buddhist movement and order, at that time the FWBO, in 1968. So really creativity comes from synthesis, from bringing different approaches and cultures and assumptions together. So he could hardly help but be creative, I think, in those circumstances. Some of his creative syntheses, his ways of relating Buddhism and Western culture, were new for their time, others maybe not. Some of them are spread in other places, or maybe been used simultaneously in other places, others don't seem to have done. So there are a spread of reasons why you might be interested in what he achieved in that area. He also had to come up with pragmatic responses to a particular situation, to Buddhism in the UK, introducing Buddhism in the culture of 1968, in Western culture as it was developing then in the very particular ambience of the late 1960s. So his pragmatic responses, particularly given his conservative temperament, there's some very interesting interplay and tensions there in the whole way that he approached things. And perhaps the most distinctive thing I find or have found about Sangharakshita's approach and that of the movement he founded is the overwhelming emphasis on practice. That he put a lot of emphasis on actually doing it, and not just not just using substitutes of any kind. Whether that's those are conceptual substitutes or distractions or practices that don't work or whatever. There's all kinds of ways we can distract ourselves from actually doing practice. So certainly my experience of the Triratna movement, as it's now called, was one where I learned a huge amount about practicing, and that's something of huge value just in itself. So he has a distinctive and interesting voice. in a larger conversation about how Buddhism relates to the West over a number of decades since 1968. Now, so that's some fairly obvious points to start with about why write a book about him, but why did I specifically write a book about him, and why did I write the kind of book that I've written? Obviously, there to answer that question, I'll have to start with a little bit about myself and my previous experience. So my previous experience of Triratna goes back to 1985, where, well, the first Buddhist I met was Vishwapani, who I believe is here. Yeah, I've had some kind of ongoing relationship with it since then, but very different kinds at different times. So I had a first phase of involvement with it up until about 1990 when I left it. And then I rejoined and got involved again in the mid-90s, and then became a member of the order, and from which I resigned in 2008. So, as you could see, well, I've had enough direct involvement in it, I think, to understand it from the inside and how it operates. But from the kind of relationship I had with it, you'll also probably work out that I had ongoing difficulties with it, even when I was working within it, if you like. And the overwhelming difficulty for me, which was the overwhelming reason why I eventually resigned from the order, was about a lack of clarity about what it stands for. So there's the authority of the Buddhist tradition, and then there were the practical requirements of the path. And a lot of the time those might lie together, but sometimes they conflict with each other. And the issue is always, what's the priority when those two things clash as priorities? And that was never clear to me. It seemed that a lot of the decision making about that was very ad hoc in the organization. So that was the prime reason, and I remember stating this explicitly when I resigned in the letter I wrote to Chapter, the Order magazine, that it was this unclarity about what it stood for. So I didn't really resign out of bitter grapes of any kind, I don't think, although obviously there were various particular difficulties, but that wasn't the reason why I resigned. So I think also, yeah, more than 10 years later, when I started to write this book, I wasn't doing it on bitter grapes terms to settle scores or anything of that kind. But I could positively use my experience of Triratna, as well as other aspects of my approach to get a balanced picture. Now, the other major element of my motivations for writing this book and getting to the point where I wrote this book is the development of middle way philosophy. So from about 1997, well, beginning with a PhD, I've been working on what you might call the project of middle way philosophy, which is now consists of about 18 books. As you'll see, the last couple of which have been published by Equinox. So, yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing project which was basically motivated by practical concerns, and it was asking basic philosophical questions, but with a practical motivation. So perhaps the most basic question in it was, how do we justify our judgments? Whether those are moral or other kinds of judgments. So the emphasis in middle way philosophy is in how we judge things, and that emphasis and the whole area of practice around judgment, you know, is an area where I've learned a huge amount from Triratna, among other things. So yeah, I developed then a theoretical understanding of that justification, and particularly of its blockages, so the ways in which our judgment is impeded by absolutization, so by the tendency to assume that we have the whole picture at any particular point when we make a particular judgment. So the middle way is the middle way between positive and negative forms of absolutization. The whole model that I developed owed a lot to Buddhism, but then incorporated a lot of other sources, incorporated a lot of Western philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, cognitive linguistics. It became a synthetic exercise with, as I say, this underlying practical goal, but a lot of theoretical development, because I felt that the theory and the practice were inseparable, and to sort out a lot of the practice in the long term, you had to be able to tackle the theory. So middle way philosophy had its fullest expression in the 4-volume Middle Way Philosophy series, which is currently self-published. I hope eventually maybe Equinox will take it and will get an academic publication of it. It's an approach which I think owes a lot in some ways to Sangharakshita originally. There are particular ideas in it which have a lot of connection with the sorts of things he talks about. So the whole emphasis on practice, the use of integration, the concept of integration, the concept of provisionality, which is very, very important in middle way philosophy, and archetypes. So a lot of my more recent writings, the one that's coming out in October and another one that's due out next year, are development of the understanding of archetypes. So all of that, Sangharakshita talks about this stuff. So I wanted to critically acknowledge that. I wanted to sort out the extent of that influence and credit it, and but also work out where I wasn't following Sangharakshita. And obviously there were also lots of reasons for being critical of him, and to work out and make clear ways that I was not in agreement with him. So that was one motive I had for writing the book. So it was, in a way, it's an application of the middle way and middle way philosophy as I developed it. I wanted to show how it could be applied, because the middle way is all about balanced judgment in which we are not diverted by absolute assumptions on either side. And so the whole standpoint of assessment that I've applied in the book is thus one of the middle way. It's one that can be further justified from my other work. It's a practical standpoint, basically. So it's not one that simply appeals to the Buddhist tradition. Obviously, somebody else could have written a critical book about Sangharakshita, saying how they thought he was or was not traditionally Buddhist, or did he quote the texts or the particular school or whatever. That's not the approach I'm taking. I'm basically asking, is Sangharakshita's thought consistent with long-term helpful practice? So there I'm drawing on arguments in my middle way philosophy work that absolutized assumptions, whether they're positive or negative or not. So that's one basis on which I can try and sort out what I get from Sangharakshita, because a lot of the ways where I feel he goes wrong are about absolute assumptions he makes, which we can't justify through experience. Another question which I often ask in the book about Sangharakshita's claims and beliefs are, is it consistent with evidence about the conditions? So evidence, most obviously from science and psychology. Sometimes also evidence, sometimes in the book I've used my own experience, but again, I've tried to make that clear when I'm doing that. Yeah, quite often one can simply ask, well, is there evidence for what he's saying here? And unfortunately, sometimes there really isn't. So those were more my personal motives then, that I wanted to sort out the influence of Sangharakshita on my own work. I wanted to apply what I'd done in a particular way. But then I became increasingly aware of also how this might be helpful for others. And the more I became involved in discussion, particularly online discussion about Sangharakshita, and saw how incredibly polarized a lot of that discussion is, the more helpful I felt it would be to try and apply the middle way to it, and just simply to offer a model of doing that. To say, look, here's me trying to apply the middle way here. How about you doing that too, folks? You know, rather than just dismissing him out of hand on the mere word abuse, you know, which obviously creates immediate reactions from a lot of people, negative reactions. Or on the other hand, lapping up everything and not really applying critical thinking to what he says. So I'm trying to apply balanced critical thinking to Sangharakshita's approaches and thinking. Yeah, so you don't have to agree with all my conclusions, hopefully, for that model or the idea of doing that to be useful. Hopefully an encouragement for you to do the same in approaching Sangharakshita and his ideas. So applying the middle way and applying critical thinking to Sangharakshita's thought involves, well, separating the wheat from the chaff, really, trying to draw at least provisional conclusions about what's helpful and what isn't. What's helpful for us as humans in the long term. It also obviously involves making comparisons with other sources, not just Buddhist ones, but also Western ones, and checking for appeals to authority and straw men and so on. So there are various quite identifiable fallacies sometimes in Sangharakshita's thinking. So one can reach or one can point out critical issues with a lot of what Sangharakshita says because of these kinds of things, but at the same time appreciate a lot of what he positively achieved. Yeah, that's really a summary of my overall aims in writing the book. Now, the way in which I went about writing the book was primarily through research into written sources that he's left behind him. But this was also supported by 7 interviews which I had with him. This was mainly in the first half of 2018, before Sangharakshita died in October 2018. So this was somewhat unexpected, really, at the time when I began working on the book. I wrote to Adhisthana asking if they were interested in helping me in any way, and they passed it on to Sangharakshita, and Sangharakshita wanted to talk to me. So yeah, it then turned out that he was very interested in being critically challenged, at least to some extent, and to talking to me. So I had this series of conversations with him. They were going to continue, actually. So I did, I think, 6 sort of normal interviews with him where I asked a number of questions, where I checked his views, that he still thought X, Y, or Z that he'd written. I also got his responses to possible criticisms. So a lot of those are recorded in the book, that he responded in this way, whether or not it's convincing. So, I made sure in many ways that I was up to date with what he actually thought. And that was sometimes illuminating. I was going to then continue those interviews in October. There was a bit of a gap between June and October because I was away working in London. Yeah, when I came back in October, I'd arranged to see him, but then at that point, he went into hospital and very quickly after that died. So I wasn't able to complete the planned series of interviews, but I did get a lot of helpful information from the ones I did. Probably the things I didn't get his responses directly on are more towards the end of the book, the although I did get his reviews on some things towards the end of the book. So yeah, so as I say, the book is not just about the interviews. It's not particularly a record of the interviews. The interviews fed into the information that I used. But overall, I think did a lot to make sure it was accurate in terms of reflecting what he actually thought towards the end of his life. So some things which you know, some people might not be aware of that in some ways surprised me. For example, that I got from those interviews were that he was fully supportive still of women, men and angels, and objected to the way in which Subhuti withdrew from the men and angels. And another was clarifying his beliefs on karma. So it's often been quoted to me that Sangharakshita said that karma is not an iron law. But he clarified his view on that, and that actually what he meant by saying that was that some actions are too small to have a more than negligible effect or any appreciable effect, and that effectively above a certain scale of action, he did believe that karma was an iron law. So that, I think, did a lot to clear up a rather confused issue. So that's just two examples of things I got from those interviews. Okay, so yeah, the rest of this time I'm just going to attempt to say a bit about the pros and cons, some of the conclusions, arguments in my book. Obviously, there isn't enough time to say very much about the contents of the book, and you will miss a lot of the justification. I could say a few things to give you a taster of what the book says. One of the major things I'd say, which one of the messages of the book really is that the limitations and the problems in Sangharakshita's thinking go much further and deeper than sex scandals. So I regard those as a symptom, not as the major problem. I mean, not to say they're not a problem, but that we really need to look at his thinking and what assumptions led to the sex scandals and to why those were a problem for the movement. So yeah, something about my overall conclusions about Sangharakshita's positive achievements then, first of all. So the I mean, generally the book follows the structure of beginning more with positive achievements, although there's always a bit of qualification even then, but starting more with his positive achievements and then moving gradually to the more controversial stuff, the more critical stuff. So I begin with what I consider to be his major contributions to the synthesis of Buddhism in the West, and conclude with the controversies, which particularly around his personal authority and lots of issues around sex and gender and families, and sexual activity. Yeah, let's start with his achievements then, positively. So some of the major things, one of the major things to start with is that he just challenged a lot of entrenched interests just by having the courage to start the new movement that he started. Just having the chutzpah to do it all is perhaps his major achievement in some ways. To set up the idea that Buddhism could be adapted and could enter into a dialogue with the culture in which it was being placed, rather than plonking a movement from somewhere else into the West. Another thing which I've already mentioned is his emphasis on genuine practice, and that also meant that he challenged various dogmatic assumptions, whether in traditional Buddhism or in Western sources. So when people replaced practice with dogmas or scholarly concerns or too much emphasis on ritual or whatever. Now, other achievements were, well, I think his use of the middle way is one of the things which has most inspired me personally in his writings and practice. And indeed, my impression is that a lot of the way in which the middle way is implicitly often used in Triratna is perhaps due to him. But his use of the middle way is usually implicit. Sometimes it's explicit as a practical way of judging things. But there is a talk, which I think is personally is one of his best, which is called 20 Years on the Middle Way. And there he gives several examples of practical balancing judgment between extreme assumptions, which give you the most helpful approach to a particular situation. So, for example, he talked about how one deals with one's parents. So you've got obviously people who are predominantly younger people getting involved in a Buddhist movement that may have attitudes and practices which are very different from those of their parents. So do you just cut your parents out? Do you stop having contact with them because they're so opposed to what you're doing? Or do you, the other extreme would be to obey your parents and not get involved in this threatening Buddhist group? And obviously he suggests, you can't just cut off your parents. They've got a major conditioning role in your life. So maintain contact with them, support them in whatever ways you can, but don't take their instructions, don't accept their authority to run your life for you. So there's that may be common sense in some ways, but it's not always obvious to people. And it involves this balancing of different priorities and avoiding getting caught up in a particular way of absolute thinking about how we ought to act. So that's one example of Sangharakshita using and indeed talking about the middle way in this practical way. Unfortunately, he also talks about it in less practically helpful ways. So the discussion of it in the survey, I find much less helpful. But I won't talk more about that now. But there's more in the book about it. Another interesting thing he talks about is the ways in which the concept of enlightenment might be a substitute for practice. So although I think he does hang on to the concept of enlightenment, he particularly hangs on to the idea of the Buddha's enlightenment as central, as a sort of Buddhist belief that Buddhists need to have. He, at the same time, is prepared to question the way that some people use it. So he's got a practical critique of the way that people get hung up on it, and stop worrying about whether they're enlightened, for example, or whether they could get enlightened, rather than actually getting on with their practice. That emphasis on, questioning absoluteness also relates to his account of integration. So I've already mentioned that integration is an idea that he used, which has sort of more or less probably Jungian, but rather psychological sources, but has been adopted and is now very widely used in Triratna. So the concept of integration as a way of interpreting, what's involved when we make progress through practice. Where do we get to, and what are we actually achieving if it's not this distant weird thing called enlightenment? He talks about psychological integration and relates that to spiritual development as it's understood in the Buddhist tradition. He also integrated, give the word being used again, integration with his whole general approach and with the institutions of Triratna. And I'd just like to read you, I think, what is my favourite passage from Sangharakshita's lectures, which is about, I think, well, it's about integration. It's also about the middle way, I think. And he's talking about what he calls the entry into non-duality. But obviously, what it's a very practical thing he's talking about, and he starts off by talking about it in the context of meditation. Okay, so I'm just going to read out. I won't be able to imitate his inimitable way of speaking, I'm afraid, which was very peculiar, but I will read it in my own voice. So, well, we have to find the entry into non-duality within the situation. How are we to do this? We have to question the very terms of the situation. That is to say, we have to question their absoluteness. We have to realize that it's not enough to try to sustain attention by means of a forcible act of will. If distractions persistently arise within the context of meditation, it means that we have not understood ourselves deeply enough. It means that there are factors at work within us, psychological factors, of which we are not conscious. And what we have to do is to become conscious of them. We have to take them into consideration. In other words, we have to become more integrated. If we are more integrated, the different elements of our being will form an harmonious whole. They will all pull and push in the same direction. They'll no longer be in conflict with one another. We'll no longer have to oscillate between them. So, in the case of distraction and attention, integration is the entry into non-duality. Okay, so he's talking about, in a very practical situation of judgment, effectively, which he's talking particularly about the context of meditation, but you could apply this in any other situation, I think. What he calls the entry into non-duality is what I would call avoiding absolutes. So avoiding thinking in absolute ways that there are two alternative possibilities. For example, either you can do this meditation and you've already got it, or you can't do it at all. Somewhere in between those two absolutes, you find a much more complex experience, which you then have to work with. And that's central to how I would understand the middle way, and it's right there in Sangharakshita at times. But he says that there. There are other passages which perhaps sort of suggest that kind of insight as well, but he doesn't seem to apply that experiential insight in a lot of other places where he could have applied it. He doesn't seem to apply it to more conceptual issues. So although there's some wonderful synthesis, I think, in Sangharakshita, there's also some startling failures of synthesis, that he just doesn't see a connection between one situation and another. And another example of that is, which actually you can listen to in the Middle Way Society podcast interview, which I did for him. So that was the final of the interviews I did with him in June 2018. And there we were talking about the middle way. This was all recorded. And I asked him about why the middle way wasn't mentioned as an approach to ethics in his writings about ethics, including particularly the 10 Pillars, which is his perhaps most important book on ethics. He said, well, I didn't think of it, always to that effect. And I said, well, should you have included it? And he said, well, maybe I should, which was, sort of disarmingly frank admission. But it just hadn't occurred to him that the middle way and ethics had anything to do with each other. So there's obviously the various compartmentalizations going on in his mind, of limitations in the way he thought, at the same time as all this creative stuff. That was another aspect of his achievements, which I was talking about. So he also he found new ways of talking about conditionality in its relationship to feedback loops. He's sort of talked about mind reactive and creative. So there's a very practical lecture which I think helped to set up the tone of the new movement quite a lot early on, called Mind Reactive and Creative. And And that's just a very refreshing, practical take on what you could also talk about as feedback loops. So a reactive state is one where we're going round and round through the same feedback loop, going through the same processes again and again. A creative one is where there's a new element feeding into the way we operate. Then the concept of provisional belief. Now that's another big thing that's influenced me. So provisionality is an important aspect of middle way philosophy. So he did make some attempt to relate the insights of scientific method and the idea that our conclusions about things need to be provisional. He attempted to relate that to Buddhist practice. Unfortunately, he really didn't follow that through or apply it in lots of ways he could have applied it, but the idea was there. He had a concept of individuality, which again I think is a very creative and helpful application of the middle way, really. So for him, individuality, or what he called true individuality, lay between the group and individualism. So true individuality, as he saw it, was autonomous and creative. So there's a link there with the creative feedback group. He also talked positively about experimentation and the value of experimentation. So, I mean, individuality is a very basically liberal concept. You know, it's deeply imbued in the liberal democracy of the West. The idea that individuals should make their own judgments about things, and the fledgling movement, the after Buddhist that then became Triratna, totally depended on this way of seeing things in the society in which it existed. You know, in a society in which people could not autonomously choose their own religion, then nobody would have been a Buddhist at that time. And in such societies, Triratna is very unlikely to make much headway today, so like Iran or somewhere like that. So the in a way, individuality is this concept where he drew Buddhism together with liberal democracy and got a key idea from it. But when we come to where he talked about liberalism, well, he never ceased to bite the hand that fed him, really, because I don't think I've really come across a reference to liberalism that doesn't have the word pseudo in front of it in his writings and speeches. So he constantly went on about really how bad liberalism was. So there's all these contradictions in the way that he spoke, as opposed to some of the basic assumptions in his ideas and the ways in which some of his basic ideas related Western Buddhist traditions. Another achievement, he drew on Jungian archetypes to help post-Christian Westerners to relate to Buddhist symbols through their experience, rather than just react to them. You know, that's funny, don't want anything to do with that. So that can be an incredibly liberating way of thinking about religious symbols generally, I think, that if you can disentangle them from whether you believe in that stuff or not and begin to relate to the meaningfulness of the symbol as an archetype, yeah, that really allows the possibility of provisional responses to religion, not ones that are dependent on dogma. So Sangharakshita talked a lot about this, developed a lot of very useful material on the Buddha's life, for example, and archetypal symbolism in the life of the Buddha. That's one of his best essays, I think. But he didn't really seem to recognize, I think, what seems obvious to me, that this is a way of liberating yourself from dogma, because he didn't always seem to want to liberate himself from dogma. Anyway, he also, going on about more achievements, he made inspiring connections between art and spiritual practice. So he had a deep aesthetic sensibility. One of the things that really encouraged me to get involved in the movement when I did as a young man was this positive view of art and the arts and the ways in which they were integrated with meditation and mindfulness and so on. Again, I haven't come across that, certainly in the same depth anywhere else. He also put a lot of emphasis on the interdependency and unity of the Buddhist path, so the way in which ethics was an intrinsic part of the path, for example, and a strong emphasis on friendship, which continues to be a big strength in Triratna today, I think. So all these big achievements, I mean, I've given qualifications on a lot of them, but they're still big achievements, and Triratna still benefits from those. However, I must now say something, and I am going to run on a bit too long, I'm afraid, but I'm going to need to say something more about his limitations and his mistakes. So, one of the first ones, he paid lip service to critical thinking. He talked about it, but my impression is very much that his education didn't really equip him to do it very much. He certainly didn't examine his own ideas very much critically. Maybe the situation he was in a lot of the time didn't help him to be challenged by others. But there certainly seem to be lots of instances where he failed to check claims he was making, or failed to respond constructively to criticism, and just stubbornly adhered to particular dogmatic beliefs that he held on to. So critical thinking, although he talked about it, was not really nurtured very much in the Triratna movement. It's not become a systematic part of practice in that movement. And I think part of the reason for that is also the emphasis that he often placed on a kind of narrowness of focus. So he obviously believed that a certain narrowness of focus is required for effective practice. So he thought there was a pragmatic argument for really just devoting yourself to what one teacher tells you and not looking too much at alternative ways of seeing things. I think there are some basic mistakes in that approach, or at least that although that may be correct up to a certain point, it was pursued way too far, and underestimates the ways in which basically being open and aware and able to respond to new points of view is really what spiritual practice is all about. So you can practically avoid it if you limit your focus too much, and particularly cut yourself off from other influences and other challenging perspectives. So that obviously contributed to the tendency for Triratna to be an introverted movement, particularly not learning from non-Buddhists, although there's some contact with other Buddhists that those don't really extend very far. That also relates to kind of long-term effect, an over-reliance on Sangharakshita's perspective itself, which can create a kind of fragility of reliance on him. So when the sexual abuse allegations came out, why were so many people upset by them? Why did so many people resign or leave the movement because of them? Well, presumably because they thought it really mattered to the whole of the order and movement that Sangharakshita didn't have the integrity that they believed him to have. Why was that such a big deal? Only, I think, because of over-dependence on his perspective, rather than a genuine nurturing of a critical and balanced perspective in the movement as a whole. So that's one area of basic issue, a lack of development and use of critical thinking. But maybe Sangharakshita himself just wasn't really equipped by his early life to do that. Another thing which I've already mentioned is that he never really resolved the contradictions between Buddhist traditional authority and the universal effective path of practice, which I would call the middle way. So he never really clearly prioritizes one over the other. And again, trying to sort of trace that in Sangharakshita's history, he talked both in his biography and when I spoke to him about his experience as a 16-year-old, when he read the Diamond Sutra, and immediately knew he was a Buddhist. So he seems to have had a sort of basic loyalty to the Buddhist tradition since then, which I tended to find when speaking to him. There was a kind of bedrock. There was a loyalty to Buddhist tradition which would not shift, and that, I think, created the tendency for him not to be able to question certain aspects of Buddhism, or not really doubt them. He would assume that they must be right in some sense ultimately, even if he was willing to try and present them in different ways so that people could access them. He wasn't willing to let go of them. So although there were some areas of traditional Buddhism he did clearly let go of, like monasticism, there were others that he didn't really. So karma, I've mentioned, rebirth, the historical enlightenment of the Buddha as something Buddhists should believe in. The Arya Sangha was this kind of guaranteed group of people who make sure that it's a true community, spiritual community. And indeed the tradition of authority in orders, so that he believed that he should have the authority to shape what his order was about. So he stressed the commitment involved in practice, what was called going for refuge. But because of the question of what Buddhism was, what the order was about, there's a crucial ambiguity in what that commitment is to. What is one committing oneself to? Obviously, one does need commitment to succeed at anything long term. But one then needs to look at what it is that one is committed to and what that involves. So he recognized that commitment to the Buddhist tradition is not sufficient for practice of the path. So when I asked him about, well, actually he gave the example of Burmese monks and their attitude to the Rohingya. So that there were some people who profess to be Buddhists who have attitudes which he believed really couldn't be seen as Buddhist. So he agreed that it wasn't sufficient to be Buddhist, in inverted commas, to actually follow the path, but he didn't agree that it isn't necessary. So that seemed to be another sticking place. So he didn't really seem to recognize that people could tread the path without being formally Buddhist, and that they could achieve a great deal on the path, for that matter. That other traditions could similarly help people. So yeah, so that's the underlying difficulty or ambiguity in his approach. Which of them, when it comes down to it, is most important? Is it Buddhist tradition, or is it the practical path? And that's not an issue about using inspiring Buddhist symbols or practices. It's just about how you justify it. You know, so when it comes to the crunch, are you going to come down to a basic potential authoritarian view that the Buddhist tradition says this, so this is what you should do, or are you going to adopt a practical basis of judgment? And again, the sex scandal seemed to me to illustrate well, the problem of an authoritarian interpretation of his role. So they wouldn't have been a problem, or not as much of a problem, if it hadn't been for those underlying issues. He also adopted dogmatic assumptions from other traditions. I haven't really got time to go into this in much detail, but probably the biggest one is Platonism. And Platonism is, I would describe it as a confusion of the embodied conditions for our experience with reactive tendencies. So basically the assumption that biology is bad, that we need to be disembodied in order to become more integrated. And I think this is just mistaken in a very basic way. And there's lots of evidence today that this is not the case, particularly if you look at embodied meaning, as well as any kind of embodied practice, really. So this is it's in basic conflict between our experience in embodied practice and Platonic assumptions. But Women, Men and Angels, which he approves of, remember, despite the fact it was pulped, is a Platonic book. So this doesn't seem to have been widely recognized, that it's an application of that Platonism to claim that men have superior spiritual potential over women, because women are allegedly more biological, bound to biology. Okay, I'll be quick about my other points. So some of his other mistakes were sweeping empirical claims. So especially on social issues, sometimes on history, he would make huge claims based almost entirely on anecdotal evidence. Maybe something he'd experienced himself, maybe something he'd heard about, maybe something he'd read in one or two sources, but no attempt really to look at what might challenge his assumptions. No attempt really to look at social sciences and everything that they might say. You know, they did exist even in the 1970s about the issues he was talking about. So give you a key example, the psychological effects of marriage. You know, he goes on about how the neurotic couple, how bad the psychological effects of marriage can be. Try looking at the evidence on this. Suggests that the majority of the time, marriage is psychologically beneficial to people. That's just what the statistics tell us. Obviously, you can argue about their interpretation, but my impression is he never looked at any such evidence about a lot of things. He wasn't interested in it. He also made big synthetic speculations about, without thinking through the meaning and justification of all the connections he was making. So cosmic going for refuge, I mean, this is just a huge, amazing thing. Speculation. I won't go into that now, it's take too long. Idealization, a lot of idealization of things which, you know, might work well in practice. So there might be a very helpful practice that he was talking about, but he would vitiate that in some ways by idealizing it. So, you know, whether he's talking about friendship, for example, or, well, the way in which the term integrate, the way in which the idea of integration is used as well. So although integration, I think, is a very helpful way of relating the Buddhist idea of spiritual development to psychological processes, he didn't take into account that integration could be asymmetrical, that is, that we can develop in very lopsided, slanted ways. Or, although he recognized that theoretically, he didn't seem to really apply that. So if you think, for example, about the ordination structure, which, you know, ordination requires a degree of integration. But what is meant by integration, I think you need to look a bit more closely at exactly what that means and what the objections to it might be with, you know, with a psychologically realistic eye. So the the Platonism also fed into his contradictory views on sex. So he believed, and it's stated very clearly, that he thought sex was intrinsically unskillful, which to me is, well, it entirely contradicts the meaning of the term skillful, because the idea of skillfulness is specific to a context and a practice, so there can't be a general whole type of activity that is unskillful. So that doesn't really make sense in the first place, but he obviously clearly believed that, and also but he also believed that sex was okay, including for him, obviously, due to the 1960s culture and the way in which he adapted to that culture when he landed in the West. So particularly that came out in his idealization of promiscuity, as he thought less generally neurotic than monogamy. So although, again, in theory, he recognizes that all kinds of sexual activity could be erotic or be healthy, actually he seemed to put a lot of emphasis on promiscuity, particularly in the earlier days, as a less neurotic option, which I think tells you a lot about the kind of attitudes that probably led to his own, what you want to call it, sexual abuse or sexual misconduct with young men. So his attitudes to promiscuity, when you get to the chapter late in my book about sex and the sex scandals, that's the thing which in his thought I think makes the most difference. It's not that this therapeutic homosexuality accusations don't seem to have any further implications. You know, he denied believing anything about that, and there's no particular reason to disbelieve him, but there does seem to be evidence that he idealized promiscuity, and that may have been partly responsible for the way in which he acted. Okay, so finally then, just to summarize, and I apologize for being over time, so how do we hold positive and negative points in mind at the same time? It's really difficult with somebody as complex as Sangharakshita. So middle way thinking is a big challenge generally. This is just one example of it. So the best of Sangharakshita's thinking implies a practical path that can address some crucial human conditions: ignorance, conflict, groupishness, dogmatism. So he provided some really creative responses to these conditions. But he didn't always succeed in following that path himself. And the sexual abuse scandals are just the most obvious indication of that problem. So whether it's Platonism or idealization, or perhaps his followers' over-reliance on his authority, all contributed, I think, to the impact of the sexual abuse scandals. So we're then left, obviously, after his death. The institutions that he founded obviously have great potential to help the world and to continue to do so. In my opinion, they really need to clarify their basis and their objectives, and they need to emerge from his shadow. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So anything I say, just to reiterate, actually, is provisional. It's based on evidence which you can look up in the book. The references, if you don't believe that Sangharakshita said such and such, it's referenced in the book. Yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions. We do have half an hour. Okay, I'm getting away from Alan.
Hi there.
Hi.
Good evening. Thanks for that. Very good. I enjoyed that. Questions, kick things. I just wondered, something I've always thought, and I wondered if it was in your book, about the arc of Sangharakshita's thinking, because obviously you mentioned a lot of the creative, critical developments and open-minded thinking. Seems to me that latterly much more conservative, the more dogmatic end that you mentioned became more emphasized. So I wondered if you had sort of any thoughts on that, and if that came out in those interviews that you had with him, given that that was a sample from a particular time in his life. I wondered if you'd thought on that.
Oh, you mean if his views changed significantly?
Yeah.
Okay, well, obviously I didn't know him at any point in his life personally.
Just from the writings.
Yeah, my impressions. I haven't got the impression that his views have shifted hugely. I did ask him about provisionality, and I asked him, could you give me an example of where you have made judgments provisionally, or a provisional judgment? And he immediately cited the example of monasticism, that he felt that when he had become ordained as a monk himself, he had been fully convinced of the value of monasticism. But then yeah, later on he became aware of many of the drawbacks and the hypocrisy of at least the Theravada system that he was ordained into. And then he reconsidered his view of it. And then we can see the evidence of that in his book 43 years ago, and the follow-up to that, where he writes critically about the Theravada tradition and monasticism and ordination. So yeah, there are examples where he's changed his view, but that was fairly early on, I think. I haven't got the impression of major shifts, say, since the FWA was founded. But I may be wrong. I may have missed something, but that's my general impression.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Hi, Vishwapani's got a question in the chat.
Okay, Vishwapani.
Yeah, I'm curious what the core of your critique is, because we can weigh up pros and cons, Sangharakshita or anyone else, but I'm wondering if you have an analysis of the core of his thought, the thought of Sangharakshita, and if you have a critique of what you consider to be central.
I think in a way I've mentioned that.
Well,
I think
maybe I find it helpful just if you could name it again.
Yeah, sure, okay. Well, the core, in terms of what I think has been most helpful, clusters around the middle way and the way in which he is sometimes explicitly, but usually implicitly used that, particularly in relation to ideas like individuality and integration. So that has strong connections with what we can also learn from the psychological tradition and the democratic tradition in the West, and the scientific method in the West as well. So that's what I discuss in the first and most positive part of the book. So in some ways, that's I know that's certainly not the way Sangharakshita himself would present his beliefs. That's what I've found or concluded is the most practically important aspect of what he had to contribute. And I realise that's going to sound probably going to sound weird to somebody who's very used to Sangharakshita's way of talking about his own views.
Robert, I'm not asking what you find most practically useful. Right. I'm asking if you've got a way of characterising his thought, which is about his thought, that you can then critique.
Well, that's exactly the same thing as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. All right. So
what are you looking for if it's not what's most practically important?
No, I'm asking. Your book's called The Thought of Sangharakshita.
Yeah.
What I'm asking is, what, in your view, is the central characteristic of the thought of Sangharakshita to which you're applying your critical framework?
Yeah.
So that can't be,
okay.
I like this bit and I don't like that bit.
Yeah, well, that relies on obviously a view of what he says, but you can look at cause in you could try and identify cause in a metaphysical way, which is probably how Sangharakshita himself would do it, or you can look at what's practically most important, and I prefer the latter approach. So I'm sure he would start talking about conditionality and enlightenment and so on as the core of what he believed. And I
suppose what I mean is, you're saying he's this kind of thinker. He's a Platonic thinker, or he's an archetypal thinker, or and then we can critique the Platonic aspect, or he has a certain kind of way of thinking that leads him to make certain authority claims. It works in this way. It doesn't work in that way because he's this kind of thinker. Yeah. So I'm just, wanting to hear what you think what kind of thinker you think he is?
I think he's a contradictory thinker. If you want that kind of characterization, he is both authoritarian and conservative, and also progressive and creative. He's a deeply contradictory figure, and his thinking is riddled with contradictions. That doesn't stop him being worth reading and understanding and looking at. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah,
No,
Hannah has a question.
I can carry on arguing with you.
Sorry, Jim.
There's a question from Hannah in the chat as well.
Hannah, okay, Hannah.
Hiya. Thanks very much. So my question was, regarding your interviews, was there ever any discussion around discipleship? Because that interests me particularly with you, how were you interviewing him? Because obviously majority of people he would be coming in contact with would have that relationship, have some degree of that relationship already with him. That would be implicit in the dialogue. But I imagine in your interviews it wouldn't have been. So I'd be interested what his views about that, if he had any views about that, and how he felt about people being his disciples or seeing themselves as that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a discussion around discipleship versus spiritual friendship. So he was famous for saying that he was happy with the term spiritual friend. But then there was his his statements, I think it was in 2007, about his attitude to the order and his authority over the order, where he did talk about what he saw as the duties of disciples to him. So I didn't really get a chance to ask him about that, I'm afraid, because there could have been much that I could have investigated more fully, and I think I was intending to do so at the time he died. So just based on the written sources, there are some I think some dogmatic issues really about the model that he takes from the Buddhist tradition, apparently uncritically, about how an authoritative teacher should relate to disciples, and particularly that disciples should give almost unlimited confirmation bias to the teacher. So it's not just a question of them giving him credibility and listening to him because they're committed to his approach to things, but deliberately limiting their engagement with other sources, which might be used to compare what he says. So that's the kind of area I discuss about that, but I'm afraid it's not based on my interviews in this particular case. Any other thoughts?
I have a question, if I can ask.
Sure.
So you said that Sangharakshita's, the alleged crimes he committed, the rapes and sexual assaults and sexual exploitation that he committed, were symptoms of his thought, rather than sort of the sort of essence of what's happening. So I'm curious then, if those are symptoms of his broader thought, and if Triratna is a movement still at the core of what Triratna teaches and practices is the thought of Sangharakshita, do you find it concerning or perhaps worrying, or is there a reflection to be had about how further symptoms of that thought in further harms might be perpetuated unknowingly even, well, probably not unknowingly, or might be perpetuated through the very structures that keep Sangharakshita as a figure on the shrine, or as the dominant figure in libraries?
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do very much see what you mean. I think I would be very concerned about that if I saw clear evidence of it. But my conclusion was that it seemed that Triratna has made a lot of adjustments. For one thing, has introduced a whole safeguarding policy and all that stuff. So it's come a long way since all this stuff broke, and it has big incentives to carry on doing that as well. You know, because of the amount of conflict and polarization that's being created. Yeah, so I was concerned to examine, you know, how far does his thought actually perpetuate this? And my conclusion, apart from the stuff about promiscuity, is not very much, really. So I didn't find anything systematic that was likely to be an important part of the teaching in Triratna, which perpetuated the kind of attitudes that looked as though they enabled the abuse.
But in that case, it's not a symptom of his thought, it's an aberration of his personality.
Well, no, I still felt in his case that, as I mentioned, the issues around his authority fed into the actual abuse itself. And then there was also his views about sex, which I found very contradictory. So there's those views, but again, I don't get the impression that those are the central issue of his authority is still there, but that's not going to be likely to result in sexual abuse now he's dead, obviously. And it's very difficult for that to be used by anybody else, I think. Yeah, there may be still some confusion about sex, I don't know, but so that's a potential issue. You know, the idea that sex is unskillful. I'd need an update on that. Do any Triratna centres teach that? I don't know. Do they examine it? Then maybe someone else could answer that question. But have we got any other questions?
Yeah, Richard Cooper has a question in the chat.
I just wondered if it had come up in your conversations with him that that he has quite an emphasis on the importance of meditation, and I wondered if he'd spoken about, or if you'd asked him about, the relationship between meditation and his thinking, his own thinking.
Well, probably when we talked about integration, that certainly came up. So his first association with the idea of integration was actually with the images used to illustrate the four jhanas, the first four jhanas. So which I can't remember all of now, but one of them is a man coming out of a swim and putting a white sheet around him. So those kind of images, which he said were directly connected this Buddhist tradition of discussion with integration, as we might experience it, or it might be described psychologically. So there were occasions like that where he talked about things that related to meditation. Obviously, I wouldn't say that when I spoke to him, he talked a lot directly about meditation experience. No.
Well, so you said something about him making some connection with the analogies with the jhanic states, but what about the rest of his thinking? Did he say anything about the relationship between his own meditation practice and, you know, all the rest of his canon of thinking? Is there any link?
Oh, well, obviously, I think there is a link in that his meditation would be conducted on the basis of the way in which he thinks, and his thinking would be stimulated and supported by his meditation. But, you know, he didn't say a lot about that specifically, no.
Right.
I guess it's one of those things that's taken for granted in the background.
Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in if any more direct link had been drawn out.
I mean, I think that passage that I read out, which is from one of his lectures, it's not from my interview with him, but you know, it's quite a striking example of that. You know, so it's about a very to my mind, very helpful example of the middle way in action, based on the example of meditation.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
There's one in the chat from Dharmachari, and I think Vishvapani also wants to ask something.
That is probably me, Dharmachari Mahamati.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Hello, Robert, from the other side of Malvern,
Hi, Mark.
where we both live.
Yeah.
There was quite a lot in what you said that I didn't understand or was not sure of as a long-term member of the order. But I want to ask focus on one particular point, what you said about Sangharakshita's view of karma, because you seem to be quite sort of, you seem to be making a point that he spoke about the iron law of karma, and that you presented that in a negative way. But I didn't recognize that. And his view of karma was definitely actions have consequences, but it was not a simplistic view of karma. So I'd like to understand more, where does this critique of karma, your critique of Sangharakshita's view of karma, come from, or what exactly is it?
Okay. Well, we need to differentiate here. I wasn't at all accusing him of having a simplistic view of karma. But I was quoting something which I've often had quoted to me initially, that he said it wasn't an iron law, and I think that's in one of his books. Anyway, I can't remember which. But yeah, the one of the basic issues is retrospective versus prospective views. So Buddhists are often keen to point out that the Buddhist approach generally does not support retrospective sort of blame based on beliefs in karma. So that would be used to support the caste system, for instance. So all that's understood. However, believing in karma is more than just understanding that actions have consequences, and I think that widely used formula among Western Buddhists is misleading, because the view of karma, the law of karma, states more than that. It's much more specific than that. That is, that specific kinds of actions, including mental actions, have morally equivalent effects in the future, which are inevitable. And having discussed that with Sangharakshita, it seems clear that that's what he believes, or believed rather, you know, whatever mental actions and whatever judgments we make will necessarily have an effect in future, which comes back to us with some kind of moral equivalence. So my objection to that view is that we can't possibly know that, and also that the way it's often presented is misleading. Actually, that it's presented as simply actions have consequences, which is something we all need to appreciate and has very wide application. Actions have consequences, but that's not the same as the law of karma. So you get into a sort of Mott and Bailey argument when the law of karma is presented as actions having consequences. So that you accept an easier version, and then you slide into a more dogmatic one.
So what I want to say, Robert, is not possible to have the full discussion, but I think I'm not saying that Sangharakshita's view was as simplistic that actions have consequences. In fact, he particularly drew out different kinds of karma. But what I want to say is that I think that the conversation that you had with him, beyond that, one needs to look carefully at his writings. And I think if you look carefully at his writings, I don't recognize it is not simplistic. That is just simply actions have consequences, which is completely correct. That is not enough. So perhaps you and Sangharakshita agree, but your book's written, so whatever's in your book, I shall have a look and make up our own minds. That's fine.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, the actions having consequences things is my experience of how karma is often presented in Buddhist classes, for example.
Yeah,
it's not particularly what Sangharakshita says.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't need to take up more time other than I'm still at the same point.
Yeah, sure.
We'll have a coffee sometime and talk more, but I'm not understanding what is the criticism. But we'll look in your book,
okay.
and with an open mind, see if there is something, but I'm not understanding.
Yeah. I mean, I expect that applies to lots of other things that I mentioned. So as I said, there were, it's quite complex, and there may be confusion about what Sangharakshita actually said in some cases. So I'm afraid you just have to read the book, and I'm very happy to receive further comments by email or whatever.
Well, I think people will need to read the book, but I also need to read more of Sangharakshita, actually. Anyway,
yeah,
I'm not going to say any more.
Yeah, which is it's quite difficult. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, that's one of the difficulties with engaging with Sangharakshita, that his writings are so extensive and not very well organised. But yeah, there are certain key things you could read, and there is a collection called the Essential Sangharakshita, which is quite useful, I think. Yeah. Maybe we've got time for one more question. Anyone has one about Nadeva?
Thank you, Robert, for a very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. It's more a comment than a question, really. Is that my sense of the movement, of which I'm a member, is that there are plenty of critical minds and intelligent minds there in the movement, and quite a spectrum. In fact, some of them are indeed here tonight.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic. I do hope your book actually goes to some way to inform the movement and its critical thinking. There's no one size fits all. It's a very diverse movement. There's a huge spectrum. There are some critical, some uncritical. There may be some still out there who actually do teach that sex is inherently unskillful. I haven't come across them myself, but I teach in a centre, and I certainly wouldn't, and I've never come, as I say, I haven't come across them. But not, it's a diverse movement, and that's part of its strength, actually. I don't know. Are you hopeful that the movement itself can develop well, you say it hasn't had that much of a culture of critique. Are you hopeful that it can develop it from your own experience?
I suppose I have some hope. Yeah, I mean, I am married to an order member who is also teaching critical thinking in the movement. There's lots of hope that things like that can happen. But I do think that the issues are about sort of central views of what the order thinks it is about. And it's unclear really what it's about. And I think to me, that's at the core of the problem, and why people tended to fall back, although there was all this sophisticated critical practice there. Nevertheless, people fell back to Sangharakshita's authority as a final solution to things in some circumstances, with very negative effects. I hope that can't happen in the future, but to stop that happening in the future, I think the goals of the order need to be a lot clearer. But that's just my impression. I'm now an outsider, hopefully a sympathetic outsider into association. Seems like a good plan. Okay, great. So if some sort of further discourse can happen as a result of this book, then I think that would be great. May or may not necessarily involve me. And as I say, the major thing I really want to communicate is not necessarily that you have to agree with what I've written, but just the mere idea of applying the middle way to Sangharakshita and having a developed, balanced examination of his assumptions. I'd really think it's a good idea for anyone related to Triratna to have a go at that and to facilitate that. Okay, well, thank you very much then. Thank you for coming this evening. Okay, so let's leave it there, shall we? It's 5 minutes past 9. Apologies for going on too late.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Robert. That was great.
Thank you.